Excellent.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'll even try to speed it up a bit. But first, I have to correct you. I'm not a doctor yet, so
Sorry, I apologize.
will be a couple months. But
Excellent.
yeah, looking good at the moment. Yeah, so I appreciate the opportunity to present here. And what I'd like to do in the next couple minutes is just to give a perspective about what we did to contribute to the field, and as other presenters today have already said, and probably the next couple will also say, we try to get into a collaborative process in the next few weeks and months, and yeah, I'll have my own perspective, and I would appreciate the participation of all the experts present here today. But let me start. Basically, I think these three papers are more or less the foundation for what we do in this area. And while the papers by Mader are more, I would say, complex to understand, I really appreciate the paper on anaerobic power and capacity, because it has got more of an practical approach, and that also led us to do what we did in our studies, which is we had our participants in a seated position on a Cyclist 2 ergometer, and we had that ergometer set to isokinetic mode at 130 revolutions per minute. And essentially, what we did in all cases was we performed body composition analysis. We performed a warm-up at 1.5 watts per kilogram of body mass for 10 minutes, then had our participants rest, and then took pre-lactate samples and post-lactate samples. Even though we indicated 8 minutes of lactate sampling, we actually, if lactate was not at its highest and dropped off by 1 millimole, we actually took more measurements, but we found that in all our cases, the highest value was in the first 8 minutes. Then, just to give an example, what has been already stated today is reliability of the alactic time is relatively poor, and therefore should be avoided, or we need to find a different solution. What we also found was that it also has a correlation to peak power. So this essentially also leads to the case, as illustrated in that graph, that the differences between a sprinter and an endurance type, given by the delta lactate, is smaller when we calculate a VLAMAX with the time to peak power, or the time to peak power minus 3.5%. So that, for me, essentially made it even more clear that we should avoid integrating these measurements because they make actual physiological differences smaller than, or they appear smaller than they are. What we also did was we looked at the energetic significance, and we know that fat-free mass is one predictor for anaerobic performance, so we displayed that here, but we can also see that differences when fat-free mass is essentially equal, that then the difference in the 15-second work or average power output during the 15-second sprint is largely explained by the lactate production, or the delta lactate between pre and post sprint values. That also allowed us to calculate a mechanical energy equivalent. So in that case, we took all the results from the previous slide, and when two participants had around the same fat-free mass, we calculated the difference in 15-second work normalized to fat-free mass, and we looked also at the relative measure of delta lactate. And then we got the result that 1 millimole of lactate accumulation is equal to 12 joules per kilogram during the 15-second all-out sprint. But as you can see, not all, even though the relationship is very good, not all of these values are on the line, especially, or for example, in this case, and that leads to the question, what is the reason for the deviation from the line? Is it better efficiency, or is it related to differences in MCT transporters? Is it lactate clearance capacity, or is it other factors? And we were unable to find solutions for that within our study, but maybe those are directions for future research. What we also did is we experimented with creatine supplementation for the sprint. So we had the same setup, also performed a familiarization, a baseline test. Then first we had a placebo trial and then a creatine trial, preceded by a loading phase. And essentially for the Vila Max niche, our question was, we wanted to determine if anaerobic energy or increased anaerobic energy by creatine supplementation leads to a higher power output, which means that is the test either maximal for metabolic reasons or for other factors. And what was expected for the creatine trial was we had increased fat-free mass and we had increased 15-second work, because creatine has been shown to increase anaerobic performance, but there was no difference in delta lactate or lactate accumulation. However, when we look at the individual response, we can see here that at least a couple of participants, they did not increase their power output during the 15-second sprint, but they actually decreased their lactate accumulation by more than the smallest worthwhile change that we calculated from our baseline test. And we would see that as an indication that these participants are limited by non-metabolic factors during the sprint, because essentially they were not able to increase their power output, but displayed decreased lactate accumulation via increased phosphate contribution. At least that's what we expect. I have to say we didn't actually measure it because we were unable to. A secondary finding, again relating to the problem of alactic time, was that under creatine supplementation, the time to peak power minus 3.5% actually decreased. So for us, those findings were kind of paradoxical, because with increased phosphate contribution, we expected higher alactic times or a higher alactic contribution, but these results would suggest the opposite. So for the whole puzzle of the sprint test, to sum up, what do we know? We and also a lot of other researchers have looked at reliability. We have looked at the mechanical energy equivalent, the alactic time, and also what I would call maximality of the test. But again, this only applies to our setup. There are other researchers that looked at the duration of the sprint test, at the gear ratio of the sprint test, and also at the effects of different nutrition and the warm-up before the sprint test. A different cadence in the sprint test might influence the settings or the results. Pre-testing might change if we actually use a setup that elicits maximal performance. Different equipment might change those results, and we might also have to change the gear ratio according to the equipment or ergometer that we use. As just presented, we might need to measure oxygen and phosphagen contribution. And we would also probably need to do that for all kinds of sprint tests, not only for the cycling test. Nonetheless, I think it's important to remember that this is only one part of the puzzle, and the whole puzzle has different parts. And while we focus, I think, on the sprint, the more interesting part, at least in my interpretation, is the endurance performance side of things. However, I'm quite astonished that as I illustrated here, in the field of exercise physiology and training science, that VLAMAX is more of a niche. And what I'd like to do, or what I'd like to aim at, is to integrate that field. Because as I see right now, we are a couple of researchers that are into this topic, but it's rarely adopted in other more generalized fields of exercise physiology and training science, and it's more or less disregarded by those fields except for a small part. One reason for that might be, and I've shamelessly stolen this slide from Oliver Quittmann a couple of weeks ago, and to appease Henning Wackerhage, I've also just added the Vila Peak blood today. And maybe that is one reason that we have a lot of different formats and denominations for this term that we look at. And in the sense of a recent editorial in Nature, Make Science More Collegial, we want to aim at a collaboration that finds a consensus in that field. So one question, do we actually need a common denomination for VLAMAX or Vila Peak or Nulamax, or I don't know what to call it? Do we need several denominations, or should we, and when we need one or more denominations, should we strive for correctness of what we actually measure, or for the ease of formatting? Do we stay scientific, or do we stay practical? Because while I see what Henning is getting at, I cannot imagine athletes adopting the term Vila Peak blood. I think they will stay with VLAMAX, but I'm just one single researcher. I do not want to give the direction that we're going to. So for this reason, we want to invite to a Delphi process to identify future directions, to gain common denominations to use, and to establish a guidance for these researchers right here, and also for all future researchers that are looking to get into this area. Because I think when we use a common language, this helps us all for references, and also helps us to increase the acceptance of our, I would say, VLAMAX niche. And therefore, we're asking you as experts to help forecast future directions, to solve these complex problems, and to build a consensus, for example, for denominations in multiple rounds. It works like that. So I have the link right here. Maybe Michael can also share that link for all of you in a email after the conference, but you can also scan the QR code on the screen right now. Following your entry into this form, we will send out invitations for the first round. We have to work with invitations because we will have follow-up rounds where we present the results of the previous round, and then we try to establish a consensus with our agreed upon findings. This is not limited to this conference, but we will also invite other experts, and also try to include experts that are familiar with the concept but are more critical of it, I would say. Okay, so essentially that is my plan. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and maybe Michael, you can end by hopefully saying that you're able to share that, or refer other questions to me.
Yes, excellent. Thank you very much for that. That was really, really good. So I have put the link into the Q&A. Hopefully it's clickable for myself. Hopefully that works for everybody else. So you should be able to look at the Q&A box, and you should be able to click on that link there. Again, I will share this after the fact. I think it's really, really important to build that consensus going forward. I think that is one of the biggest key aims for this conference for myself, is actually, can we build that consensus so we're all singing off the same hymn sheet, as one would put it, and that should help collaborate and take that scariness away. If we keep calling it 10 different things, then how are we going to build that consensus, and how are we going to offer that out to the wider exercise physiology field? Excellent. Thank you very much for leading on that Delphi process as well. I think that's going to be really important. It's going to really push it through. So we've got 2 questions in the chat then. So first one, we'll take this one first. It sort of builds onto that. So do you think one can achieve the true maximal rate of glycolysis in an in vivo test? This was from Henning.
I don't know. One of the reasons we did the creatine, and that also belongs to the other question by Jamie, I think, is we wanted to try to see what happens when we increase metabolic power, because we assumed that creatine supplementation increases available metabolic energy, and phosphagen is the main energy source for or during the 15-second sprint. And so we wanted to see what happened. And as I've shown on the one slide, a couple of participants actually decreased and their delta lactate. So for these participants, I would answer with a definite no. For others, I cannot say. I mean, it could be that they reach maximum glycolysis for a short period of time, but that's not actually what we measured. So this is only a guess. But for the others, I would for those that decrease delta lactate, I would say they definitely cannot reach the true maximal rate of glycolysis in our testing setup.
Excellent. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, really good. Okay, I think it's probably best if we leave it there, just in the interest of time, so we don't run over too much. If we have any more questions, I will send them out to you. Again, I'm going to share out the link that you've provided after the conference. I think it'd be really good to have as many people as we can be involved in that process as possible.
Thank you. And I'm just going to add, I've put some questions already in that are from my perspective, but even more important are your perspective. So feel free to add anything that comes to mind from your perspective. It is much appreciated.
Excellent. Thank you very much.